Social Capital founder and CEO Chamath Palihapitiya knows a thing or two about tech and Facebook. The venture capitalist, former Facebook insider, is counted as one of Silicon Valley's most candid tech leaders. Earlier, we spoke with Chamath to get his take on some of the top tech headlines. I started by asking him about his concerns about President Trump's policies.
It's really not the policies, quite honestly, but it's the unintended consequences, and specifically what I think is really scary is about what the long-term impacts to human capital are in the United States. So if I had to use a sports analogy, when your job is to win a championship, what you do is you try to draft and recruit from free agency the absolute single best players in every position you can, put them on the field or the court in order to win. Similarly, the United States, up until, frankly, quite recently, has been that equivalent for human capital. If you were very good or really good at anything, you want it to come here. And what's interesting is the early data is starting to show signals that that is changing. And I think that's bad. So that's irrespective of any ideology. We want the smartest, best people here working on behalf of Americans and America. And anything that impacts that, I think, has long-term negative consequences to GDP and value creation.
How's he impacting venture capital so far?
Well, so again, on the human capital side, I think what we're seeing is a lot of businesses that are frankly having a terrible difficulty recruiting people. And so what that means is wage inflation, which doesn't really add to anything because all that means is you're burning more money without necessarily incremental productivity. Number one. Two is you're starting to see competitive businesses now be created in increasing velocity outside of the United States, in Canada, in China, in India. That's generally bad if you think about businesses that could theoretically be built here where the value then is captured within the United States.
So you think the U.S. could lose its pedestal?
Oh, no, I think it's losing it. In fact, we saw a report today that said that MBA programs, and we can debate about the long-term value of MBA programs, but they've seen the most marked decline in applications from foreign applicants. Now, in the short term, that may be good, but in the long term, the reality is there are some free agents we should just be poaching from other countries and putting them on our team.
You spent a lot of time with Mark Zuckerberg in the early years navigating some rough times at Facebook as the company matured, as Zuckerberg matured. Do you see any parallels with what's going on with Uber and Travis Kalanick?
It's hard to know because I'm not in the situation in the boiler room at Uber. But here's what I'll tell you about Facebook, which was that in those moments where we push certain boundaries, say, for example, in the way that we build and design certain products, or, how we were exploring the consequences and the reach of privacy, and we had our hands slapped or we learned things, what we did was internalize the cost benefit and the trade-off of the potential of what we wanted to build and the impact of that to humanity versus taking a more methodical approach. And since then, I have to say, Facebook has been basically flawless. And I think the opportunity for them to realize is that their ego is not nearly as important as their impact. And the minute that you make that transition, there's just a different caliber of individual, particularly at the very senior ranks, that you can attract that will want to work with you on those kinds of problems. And it seems, at least from the outside, that there's a lot of early signals that that transition is happening. So I hope that it's working because the human potential impact of Uber is undeniable.
So what are your recommendations to Travis specifically? In your position outside the boiler room as an observer?
Well, I think that when you are in a company that is that iconic and unique, the biggest thing you have to do is become a lot more introspective and become what I call inside-out validated. So, when stars and famous people and rich people and CEOs call you and want to spend time with you and take you out and invite you to things, all this external validation that tells you you're important, you have to ignore it. And in fact, you have to run away from it. And you have to spend time with your engineers in the boiler room of making the product every day. And when you strip yourself of that outside validation, you learn to validate yourself inside out. And I'm not saying that he hasn't done that, but what I will tell you is if you can make that transition, you become an extremely powerful CEO, and I think Mark is a great example of what that looks like.
My colleague Brad Stone wrote a book comparing Uber to Airbnb. I'll put the question to you like this: Uber or Airbnb?
I think if you had to pick a more natural monopoly that had pricing power at scale, I think it's Airbnb. The reality with Uber is that it is a fundamental consumer surplus business where there is still risk that the entire business model is about cost of capital, meaning that in a world of autonomy, what you have is the ability for new entrants with huge balance sheets Google, Apple, Facebook, companies that you never would have imagined competing with you could, because it is just a function of having enough money to buy enough autonomous cars because you already have the customer reach, and you can then model the demand well. So in a market like that, there's potentially value erosion over time because you have more players, not less. Now, in the case of Airbnb, what they really have to navigate is cost-effective customer acquisition at scale. So instead of having many problems and many potential competitors, Airbnb has to solve an internal capability issue. And if they solve that, then that is probably the next massive company to come out of Silicon Valley.
You're really bullish on Amazon, though you also spend a lot of time at Facebook. Amazon or Facebook?
So, the thing that I think about is you have to fundamentally be in the largest, most unconstrained market possible. And when you look at the world and where dollars are spent, advertising in and of itself is a $200 billion plus market. It's created now $1.1 trillion of value between Facebook and Google. It's incredible.
But Facebook is running out of space to put its ads.
But at the end of the day, the thing that is fundamentally unconstrained is consumption by consumers. Wherever there are people who are making more money than they spend, they will find a way to allocate whatever's left over to buying things. And to the extent that buying things is the most important part of GDP, which it is in America, and it tends to be in most developed nations, the company that dominates in selling you things you want to buy will probably be the largest company in the world, and probably by many orders of multiples than anything else. And so, I'd have to pick Amazon.
And you have historically been fairly pessimistic about Apple. Where are you today?
We don't hold it. I look at it as a really interesting value stock. I don't view it as a company that represents for me what I want to own, which is, basically innovating on the future in ways that represent change. And at the end of the day, I also think a balance sheet that distributes cash back to investors is essentially saying, we believe you know what to do better than we know what to do. And so I think all of that speaks for itself.